Hello, YouTube. Welcome back to my little corner of the internet here. Brian with City of the Immaculata. As you might have noticed, I did the old bait and switch on you. I was going to talk about Chalcedon today, but as I mentioned last week, I wasn't quite ready for Chalcedon. As you also noticed, I'm back in my usual place of residence, so I should be able to get my notes together for Chalcedon next week, and it's going to be a good one, so tune in for that. Today, though, we are going to cover something that's a little bit more controversial. It's hard to be more controversial than Chalcedon, at least for those that were living during the days of the Great Ecumenical Council. But in terms of our own times, we're going to talk about something that's a little bit more controversial for our own day and age, which is the subject of meditation and yoga. And can the two ever be baptized? Baptized is just a nice way of saying, can we ever come to ways in which the yoga in particular, because it's such an umbrella term, could be brought into the fold and exercised of its troublesome parts and retained of its maybe more useful parts. And the very first thing that we need to discuss before we go anywhere in this topic, actually, the very first thing that I need to discuss is you're probably going to hear my dog bark because he's back home and he's in that protective zone again. So Chauncey, my dog, has become a feature of my lives. So he'll probably be giving his little speech here in a little bit. But besides that, the thing that we need to talk about is it's something I rarely, if ever, see Catholics discussing when they address this topic. Most of who I see talking on this subject are admittedly either very traditionalist or very progressive, both of whom seem to either not know what they are talking about or they're just being intellectually lazy or intellectually dishonest. I don't know which would be worse, but one of those two. The key thing that they all seem to miss is that when you take on a subject like religion in India, you are never, ever, ever talking about something monolithic or unified or simple. As a matter of fact, whenever you talk about religion in general, it's hard to make religion is almost a pointless term. It helps us to categorize this phenomenon that we see humans engaging in. But when we apply things like, you take like a high church Anglican and a Mormon in their theology, or not even a Mormon, let's just say like a Jehovah's Witness, a high church Anglican and a Jehovah's Witness. And I've heard Catholics label both of those as Protestant. If those two things are under the same umbrella as Protestant, then the term Protestantism has effectively lost all meaning. Christianity is honestly one of the more simplified religions in this respect because I mean, and even just leaving Protestantism to the side for a moment, Catholicism and all of its rich complexity is probably one of the simplest things that we can define when we say, What are you guys talking about when you talk about a religion? Catholicism has clear demarcations, clear boundaries of what is authentically Catholic and what is outside of the boundaries of what we would define as strictly being Catholic, as opposed to a religious practice that you may see various peoples and various cultures engaging in. There was a wonderful article years ago. I don't know if he's still on First Things, and I know he's a controversial character, but David Bentley Hart, love him or hate him, when he first came on the scene, gosh, it's been over 10 years at this point when I first came across Hart. Um, he originally came on the scene. It was not for his controversial takes on Christianity. Hart originally came on the scene for his engagement, which was often a just a one way like steamrolling over top of what this thing that was happening like 15, 20 years ago called the New Atheist Movement. And Hart was like, I heard there's a fellow who's got a channel on here called Philosophy for the People. If you haven't seen that, go check it out. It's a good channel. And I heard him mention Hart recently, and he noticed something that I noticed too. And I thought I was the only person who noticed this, because the Harts, the family of the Harts, are from Baltimore. And I've always had the sense that David Bentley Hart was influenced by H.L. Mencken. If you guys are not familiar with H.L. Mencken, he was this like muckraking journalist from the early of 20th century who had just an acid pen, and he would eviscerate his opponents. And Hart, I've heard, there's quite a few people that criticize Hart for especially when he's engaging other Christians. But when he was doing it to atheists, we were all kind of hoorahing him on. Anyways, he had this article years ago, First Things Magazine. It's maybe still available online, where he went after Daniel Dennett, one of the new atheist, what do they call him? One of the four horsemen of the new atheist movement. Absolutely eviscerated Dennett in this article. It was almost like you almost felt bad for Daniel Dennett. And one of the things that Hart noticed in this was this thing that this phenomenon that we put under this category of religion. And when the new atheists are attacking it, they think they're attacking something that's like clear and defined. When in reality, some of these things are so far removed from one another that if you ever hear someone discussing this topic in particular, the Hindu faith of the Indian people, and they do not acknowledge the complexity of the subject, it's just move on from that person, because they don't know what they're talking about, or they're just evading the facts. Religion in India is diverse as any, or even more diverse than anything you will find in Christianity, even taking into account all of the various Protestant denominations, all of the various ways in which the Christian faith is expressed around the world, all of the various heretical sects. Considering all of those, I would pit India against that as more diverse. It's even really more diverse than Islam, which is about as diverse as a religion as you think is humanly possible. Even more than these is this thing that we umbrella under the wholly inadequate term Hinduism. Excuse me. Let me take a sip of my Red Bull here. Got to get caffeinated up. There's gonna be no meditating on the city of the Immaculata today. We're gonna get caffeinated up today. The term Hindu is honestly the English colonizers really just being lazy about categorizing their Indian subjects, when they even bother to notice their cultural as well as what we in the West would identify as their religious practices. And it's rather unfortunate, because I have seen Catholic commentators say silly things like Hinduism is a polytheist religion, when in fact parts of what we call Hinduism, parts of it is polytheist, but beyond that, there's parts of it that are more monotheistic than what you would find in the Abrahamic religions, and especially within the Trinitarian religion of how we view the triune God. Just to give you an idea, and to be clear here, I am always honest with you about my limitations. And as I know them, and I am not an expert on the various strains of the Hindu faith. The ones that I have studied, the one that I've studied in particular is the Vedanta, And even there, I'm by no means an expert. I would put myself on an amateur level of expertise. It was just a passing interest of mine at one point in my life. But I know enough to at least give you all an idea of what we are talking about and just how crazy diverse it is and how silly it is to try and say things about it in a general form, the way that I so often see the subject broached. So to begin with, there are roughly six what we would qualify as orthodox schools of the Hindu philosophy. And again, keep in mind there are areas in which these six schools overlap. There are areas in which they are wholly different. Even within the subsets of a single tradition, the variances are enough that we would classify it as a completely different system, even though they fall under the same heading. So I'll try to illustrate what I mean by that as I go along. The first school is Samkhya. Samkhya is a dualistic philosophy that sees reality as comprised of matter and consciousness, and it's differentiated from the others as by its largely rationalistic epistemology. The second school is yoga. And keep in mind here, we're simply talking about yoga as a philosophy under the orthodox schools, not yet as an exercise. It, like Simkhaya, is dualist between mind and matter, and it has a series of ethical based philosophies which differentiates it from Samkhya. The third is Vaisheshika, which is a type of rationalism that believed the universe is made up of individual atoms. It's an atomist philosophy. It has its own unique studies of epistemology, of ethics, etc., similar to the fourth school, Nyaya, which is a school that uses the ancient Sanskrit Vedic text for its canon. It believed that suffering was due to certain human defects that misunderstood reality, and that liberation, also known in the Sanskrit language as moksha, was the goal of the individual is the goal of the individual was to rid itself of pain. In this sense, it's not unlike and it's partially related to the what would become the Buddhist religion. The fifth school is Mimamsa, which also uses the Vedic texts. It was concerned with proper exegete of the texts in the areas of ritualism. Within its various subsets, you will find anything from atheism to very theistic concerns. Now, they believed, even the atheistic schools, it's an interesting fact about this one, they believe that the soul is eternal and that through ritual, which is why they're so concerned with exegete of the Vedic texts, that through ritual you will find your proper place in the universe. A complex concept known as dharma is part of this process that dharma really has no English equivalent to even compare it to. So we're going to leave that alone. The sixth school you have is the Vedanta school, and it's the last of the orthodox schools that used the Vedic texts. It's concerned principally with exegesis of those texts, and within its subsets, you will find dualism, you will find pantheism, you will find panentheism, and you will find monotheism. It's in my personal opinion the most interesting and philosophically robust of all of the Indian schools. And if you want, go back and watch. I've got a video, a live that I did very early on in this channel called, was it a live or was it one I posted? It might have been one that I posted. So there's my dog saying hello to you all. So it was very early on and it's called something like, should Catholics be engaging with Eastern philosophies, or what philosophies, Eastern philosophies should Catholics be engaging with? Something to that effect. If you want to learn a little bit about Vedanta, I cover it in that. So are you beginning to see yet? Do you see how absurd it is to put all of this under a single umbrella and try to make general statements? And we haven't even begun discussing the way in which yoga or meditation are used colloquially in the West today. I mean, oftentimes when I see Catholics confusing the admittedly confusing subject, conflating yoga as a philosophical school with yoga as a spiritual school or yoga as an exercise. Look, I mean, I'm not above criticizing something when I think it's wrong, but my goal in all of this stuff is let's not mischaracterize what it is that we are addressing. I mean, we're Catholics, right? We have a robust methodology when it comes to approaching various subjects. And when I feel like so often when we took on Plato, when we took on Aristotle, we jumped in and we got through the mess of it. And it could be messy at times. And there's still areas in which we disagree. But when Aristotle came on the scene, when his manuscripts arrived back into the West, and the West started engaging with Aristotle, look, there was a school that of traditionalists of the time that wanted Aristotle completely condemned, and in fact, there were a series of condemnations in the late 13th century of Aristotle, but the rigorous minds in the faith waded through the subjects. They weeded out the bad from the good. Same thing with Confucius, not dissimilar to what happened with Aristotle. There were times when the Confucian thought was being condemned by certain circles within the Catholic Church, but eventually the church kind of comes around and says, okay, these are areas that we can leave for the theologians to deal with and handle, but two, the people living on the ground who this is a part of their history and their past, to not just come in and steamroll over it entirely or dismiss it completely, but to pull out of it, right? Pull out of it the light of the subjects that we can. I don't see people doing that with Hinduism. They sort of like lazily dismiss it because the pictures look weird. Their iconography, which their iconography does look odd to Western eyes, admittedly, or the ritualism is strange, or whatever the thing might be, right? We completely dismiss it as pagan, but that the like whole pagan dismissal of a subject is not consistent with what we have historically done as a Catholic faith. And honestly, it doesn't make Catholicism look good when we wholesale dismiss something that has survived for hundreds, if not thousands, of years within a culture. But let's start to break this specific one down a little bit. So we said that yoga as a philosophical school is dualistic, with all reality broken down into matter and consciousness. Living beings are said to wed the two distinct dualistic realities of mind and matter into a single being. Within this single being of mind and matter, there are various imbalances of sense, mind, emotions, elemental matter, and these imbalances are what causes our pain, our experiences of suffering. Liberation, a moksha, is properly is properly balanced of all a proper balance of all of these constituent parts achieved through a certain degree of knowledge and aesthetical practices. It has its own what they call sutras. Sutras are basically like in the text you will find these almost lines of like chants, and there might be repetition or there might be variance among them. They're literary textual traditions combined with prayers if we loosely define the verb to pray. One of the things that you'll hear one of the schools of this, the terms of mantras, right? These repetitions of things that they say. Yoga as a philosophy shares most of its metaphysics and its epistemology and its sutras with Samkhya. And in fact, some scholars say that the two can't be said to be separate schools until as late as the ninth century AD. Some of its rules per its sutras are rules of nonviolence, rules of truthfulness, admonitions against stealing, so a certain recognition of autonomy and private property, rules of celibacy, lack of greed, purity of mind and body and speech, certain degrees of austerity, a commitment to studying the Vedic texts. There's a high emphasis on exegete there, and one that I want to discuss more in a little bit, a term called santosa, which can be classified as a sense of contentment, an acceptance of one's circumstances with an added like optimistic outlook or projection on future events. I want to come back to that in a little bit here. Now, yoga as a philosophy does allow for theism, unlike Samkhya, though there is no consensus of what this means. It can range from a personal god to something more similar to what you would find in Advaita non dualism of the Atman from the Brahman. Okay, so now let's get really complex with it and confused. The history of the emergence of yoga as a multifaceted system of philosophy, religion, and exercise. Now, we know that yoga emerges in the historical record in the Vedic texts. There are off branches of it that flow down into Indian practices as well. You'll find it mentioned in Buddhist practices and Jainism. And from these early texts and practices, you get the philosophical branch that we just discussed. Now, there are at least 13 source texts from which the practices originate, spanning several centuries, each with hundreds of commentaries on how or what yoga is and how it's to be practiced. Several scholars have tried, and keep in mind, these are usually Western or Western-minded scholars. You know, we Westerners, we love our classifications. But remember, classifications are oversimplifications every time that we do it. But they have tried to reduce all of the core goals down to a few things like a stilling of the mind, the monkey mind that it is sometimes called, mind of anxiety and trouble and panic and whatever it may be, gaining a gaining of certain insights about self and reality and the universe, etc., which ultimately for the theist schools of yogic philosophy lead to a unity with the divine or the Brahman or with the Atman, right, with the self. From this basic of premises, you get all of the many traditions of yogic practices, as we mentioned in Jain and Buddhism and Hinduism, etc., etc., etc. Now, its popularity in the West is interesting and way too detailed for a subject like this, which is just sort of a gloss history. But while there have been a hazy cross pollinizations that we'll discuss in a bit, that took place over centuries, the real takeoff of interest in this began in the 1960s when the Beatles, the British rock group, traveled to India. And when they came back, they brought back with them an interest in Eastern practices that the hippie youth of the 1960s took up at times with a very shameful appropriation that became this monstrosity that we today refer to as New Ageism. A New Ageism that is every bit as convoluted as Hinduism itself is as a term that's useful to us. These Western white European gurus were basically kids co-opting the term guru, and they became these sort of self-styled gurus that cherry-picked certain aspects of Eastern religions that they never really seemed to fully grasp to begin with. And at that point, it becomes so befuddled that I'd be here for hours trying to unpack it with you, like trying to untie the knot that is modern New Age spirituality. What one self-styled guru claims is Eastern religion is really just their own hodgepodge mishmash of things that they've read in tracts or heard from some speech by a yogi or whatever, right? Whatever it may be that they're trying to sell you. As you're all aware, though, eventually the product of this, out of this, sprang the yoga studio on every street corner of suburban America by the late 2010s, at least, right? And each one of these studios may or may not adhere to the various forms of its original spiritualism or philosophical systems, however convoluted and watered down into a new ageism that it may be, though many are simply advertised, self-advertised anyways, as strictly a secular endeavor to promote exercise or some kind of therapy. Now, it's at this crossroads that we as Catholics find ourselves trying to assess this cultural phenomenon. And I think, which it's undoubtedly is at this point a full on cultural phenomenon, at least here in the United States, probably in Europe as well. And it's here that I want to try to parcel out a few factors for you guys to take into consideration. I could easily turn this into a several part series, but honestly, I don't want to. So I'll do my best to break down the points for you all to pick it up and do the work yourselves. And maybe one day we could make sense of all of this, probably generations from now, but just a few things that I would like to address. One, yoga as a strictly scientific, empirically verifiable form of exercise and therapy, be that for stress relief or physical therapy, etc. Two, yoga as a spiritual exercise, and can that be separated from the first point? Three, are there any comparisons, either received or condemned, in Christian history between this thing that we call yoga and the meditation practices that go along with it? And then finally, four, what areas, if any, of it spiritually could we extract and possibly incorporate into our own? So, first, yoga as a secular practice. There have been multiple evidence-based clinical studies with controls that have come back with pretty positive results for the concept of like stretching the body, increasing flexibility, as well as interesting things about practicing what they call mindfulness and relaxation, which I'll get to here in a little bit. And to this, I can actually, to get personal, I can actually speak from some experience without getting into it too much. I have a host of health issues that I've faced in the last few years, brought on by certain degrees of illness and stress. And it has resulted in me having to adjust certain ways in which I approach day-to-day life. I've done some videos discussing that in the past. Maybe you've caught it, maybe you haven't. But just to give you two things that I deal with. One is PTSD, a type of trauma, as well as something called dysautonomia, which, long story short, means that my body's ability to judge when I should be in a state of rest or when I should be in a state of fight or flight is basically out of whack. The autonomic system, it's not like when people hear, like, something like what would fall under a category of like a panic attack. It's not like, oh my, I'm afraid something bad's going to happen. It's more like it's not just like your mind is upset, right? The autonomic system regulates many physiological functions, including your heart rate, your respiration, your digestion, your hormonal secretion of things like adrenaline. And believe me, folks, as God is my witness, and God and my family as my witness, I have went the routes of traditional Western medicine to the nth degree, none of which I see people making videos about condemning certain secular Western medical practices. You don't see like Catholics online, should we condemn Western medical practices, like the way that they talk about condemning certain yogic practices. All of it, I mean, all of it has failed to help me. And yet, certain breathing practices, certain stretches, certain degrees of mindfulness techniques have helped me to function day to day and even begin the process of recovery out of that like state of illness. So I'm a bit of a case study in that respect. Now, I haven't gone all in. I don't go to yoga proper. But I have been through a recovery program that has sessions where people relax and practice mindfulness, do very simple kind of like vagus nerve stretches, controlling your breath. And I have also incorporated myself very old stretches that I've learned way back from with my days of practicing Wing Chun Kung Fu. And who knows what those stretches, the origination of those stretches are. It's martial arts, but I'm sure there's probably some kind of like ancient religious practice. Some of those old like Sinam Chow and Jum Ki, those old Wing Chun forms that you would do, which are certain stretches. So I mean, judge me if you will. I whenever I do these videos on certain Eastern topics, I lose followers anyways. But look, it's not a popularity contest for me. I have a family I'm responsible for. I'm relatively young, and I had otherwise been very healthy all of my life. And I'm doing medically what I can do to repair my body so that I can get back to living life. And so that as a and to be clear, I don't I'm one of my weak areas in theology and in the faith is in bioethics and certain like moral ethics and how to parcel all of these things out. But keeping certain stretches, certain breath techniques, even mindfulness as a means to an ends, right? Not necessarily as an ends in itself, in a secular sense of a practice to heal the body. I think there's probably some room for allowance there, though I haven't seen it necessarily addressed adequately by experts in these fields of like bioethics and things like that. Now, the second part related to this, because this is where it gets really choppy, right, is yoga as spirituality. I think the first thing to keep in mind is that Western medicine is behind the eight ball, at least since the divorce of faith and reason in modern Western society, with catching up with the fact that you cannot nicely separate the wellness of bodily health from mental health and from spiritual health. They're all related, they're all intertwined. You as Catholics, we know this, right? This is why we go to things like the sacraments. This is why there are healing sacraments, right? The anointing of the sick. So, just practicing yoga for exercise as a physical thing for exercise with someone like myself with a chronic illness could very well get me nowhere. Okay. Which is why many Western doctors now, I've sat in certain clinics with doctors speaking with them, are recommending yoga, at least yoga as stretching, but as well, they're starting to recommend meditation, for which us Catholics can be a point of contention. Now, we have in Catholicism, we do have forms of meditation. We even have a level of prayer that involves what we call prayers of quiet. Yet, Yet the West has long had a problem with a certain type of quiet prayer. Even Teresa and John of the Cross, who were pioneers in articulating this type of prayer, came up against pretty hard opposition, in particular from the Jesuits, who in the style of Ignatius sought to promulgate a form of a visual prayer. One of the lesser known, though interesting, condemned forms of prayer is a practice called quietism, a Spanish theologian in the 17th century that promoted this form of mental quietness that pushed for the self toward self annihilation, toward greater absorption into the Godhead. And it was officially condemned in 1687 by Innocent XI in the bull Celestis Pastor. One of the relevant things about this is that it condemns this almost indifference of the self toward its destiny, and that was really sort of the clincher for quietism. That is the self towards its destination of either heaven or hell, not as an end. I mean, obviously, the individual quietist would want to go to heaven, right? It's not We're not trying to straw man them, but as a practice in this form, a means, if you will. Remember, we said that one of the goals of the school of yoga meditation was santosa, a sense of contentment with one's place. And this could potentially be troubling. Look, I get in the process of recovery for a health issue, and I'm talking about on a physiological level. In so much as we can distinguish between physical and spiritual, acceptance of one's physical state does allow the process of healing to begin. I don't deny that, and there's empirical evidence to show that. But as a goal, as an end in itself, I'd have a hard time stretching one to reach the other, as we as Christians must always keep our eschatological ends on the horizon in front of us. Now, I'm not saying that there isn't a sense in which medically it may be useful, even applied to to accept one's state and to practice certain mindfulness techniques of one's state to project healthier outcomes for oneself. But it would really have to be for Catholics, you would have to be under the direction of a good spiritual director who was aware of what your medical goal was, how to navigate that against against your ends as a member of the body of Christ seeking to get to heaven. And hopefully I'm making sense here, because it's admittedly a tough subject. You've got several things going on here. The physical reality that there's evidence to show that certain things about stretching and breathing and mindfulness physically helps to heal the body. But we're also learning that there is no separation between the physical, mental, and spiritual aspects of healing. Okay. So, is there a way to extrapolate from yoga some of these stretches, some of these breathing techniques, even some of the mindfulness as a means, not an ends in itself? That santosa is sort of an ends, right? The ends is an emptying of the self, a self annihilation that was condemned under the practices of quietism. But as a means, right, to an ends of recovery, can we at this point begin to place into this process the spiritual aspects of it, right? To remove the troublesome aspects spiritually of yoga, to extrapolate those processes which are maybe helpful, and then into that spiritual side place Christianity. That's sort of the ultimate question to all of this. A big part of the condemnation, and this would take an expert in this niche area of quietism, but a big part of the condemnation against Molinos being the Spanish theologian who was a writer on this subject of quiet prayer. Molinos is condemning him. Part of it was condemning his condemnations of certain mental practices, especially those used by the Jesuits. And my reading in it is that it's not so much about prayer of quiet per se, as it is about its exclusivity against other forms of prayer, like the mental type of prayers of the Ignatian forms of prayer. Because as I mentioned, right, Teresa's prayer of quiet is about stillness. It's about peacefulness and restfulness, and that's isn't unlike what we look for in the commonly used meditative practices that a doctor might recommend for a patient when the doctor says, I want you to start practicing meditation. Now, this is, of course, a higher level of prayer within the realm of prayer in the Catholic life, predicated on a state of grace. But it is one that we should all be striving for, right? There's no exclusivity that you have to go join a monastery to reach prayer of quiet. The purpose of some of the spiritual exercises is that we could reach that state of stillness and peacefulness and restfulness as Catholics. Another thing to consider with all of this is you have the hesychasts of the Eastern Orthodox who practice a form of almost non-mental prayer, as well as very particular breathing techniques and very specific postures that appears to be at least distantly related maybe to certain pranayamic breathing practices of yoga. Now, Callistos Ware, God rest his soul, explicitly stated that hesychasm is not quietism as condemned by Rome, but it is also very unlike the meditative practices of St. Ignatius of Loyola. I've even seen some of the more fundamentalist Orthodox try to condemn mental prayer as we practice it, but that's problematic as the goal of Ignatian prayer is to meditate on biblical events, right? Especially the life of Christ. So to condemn, and to condemn that, I to say that we can't meditate on the life of Christ, that we must empty our minds as we read sacred scripture would be problematic to say the least. But anyways, the emptying of self as an end, insomuch as it is the goal of yoga practice, shouldn't be one that we are engaging in. There's another, gosh, it's another like throw a wrench in the wheel, this thing called centering prayer, which I am probably going to hold off on centering prayer for right now, though it's intimately related to this whole subject. I'm actually getting ready to take a course in spiritual direction this year through the Avila Institute, and we're going to be doing some lecture. I'm going to be going through some lectures on centering prayer. So maybe I'll set that aside for right now and come back to it later. But as a medical goal, I believe that there may be some ways to combine the physiological benefits of yoga with Christian ascetical practices of prayer. I mean, yoga simply as the physiological things that you're doing of stretching your body and breathing properly, and even mindfulness to a degree. So for example, when I work on correcting my dysautonomia while doing mindfulness practices, while practicing very calming breath work, I will pray my rosary. Or in my more LARPing moments, I'll do the Chaki prayer, right? So that's what this is right here. This is the Chaki prayer. So I'll be doing the Jesus prayer. And I know some Indian folk will cry that that's cultural appropriation when we do this, but honestly, if medical practice is a cultural appropriation is problematic, then you guys who are out there that are criticizing appropriating some of these things, you should stop appropriating our Western advances in medicines, like things like germ theory, right? I kid there. Now, I'm wholly convinced that in the areas of health, you cannot separate the spiritual from the mental from the physical. They are interconnected to the degree that, for example, spiritual sickness will manifest itself as mental or physical sickness, or any other combo that you want to add there of those three. We can show empirically that certain stretches, certain ways of breathing, certain ways of being mindful can have an effect on the recovery of the human body positively. And as we have discussed, there is no 1, 2, 3, 20, 30 ways of talking about this thing called yoga. There's endless expressions of it philosophically, metaphysically, spiritually, physically, so on. So to say this aspect of it is harmful to you as a Christian is to say like this one specific aspect of yoga is harmful to you, says nothing about all the other 500 ways that you could look at it. And for all the disparaging marks that the Vatican has said about yoga, if you read it, which I've read a few of them, it seems to be mostly or even completely about this new age sort of cringe versions of yoga that most of us find laughable anyways. When you have these sort of white suburban gurus wanting to tell you about, the bad karma, man, or the bad man, you got bad vibes and energy, like, yeah, I mean, to a degree, like, we should laugh at that. I do believe, energy is something that scientifically we haven't begun to approach yet as it pertains to its spiritual significance. But I mean, just look at something like the observer effect. If you don't believe me, the observer effect. Gosh, how do I even begin with that one? So I'm not even going to go into it. Just look up the observer effect, right? But that's a long way from this, bro, man, you're crushing my positive vibes, man. I don't even think on a physiological level, something like, this is not necessarily related to the Hindu practices, but meridians, as the Chinese medicine has been teaching for centuries. I don't necessarily think that's wrong just because it's pagan, quote unquote pagan. As I've done acupuncture, and for what I was treating, it was way more effective than the drug popping Western medical approach to my treating my body was. And honestly, something like the monkey mind, right? Like, I mean, we've acknowledged the monkey mind in the West for centuries. We've known about acedia for centuries now, and we could even have some effect if the monastic world would get out there and attack it in the ways that we have been doing in the West for centuries now. There's a great book, it's a classic, it's called The Noonday Devil, which is on the subject of acedia, and which is really what the yogis are talking about when they talk about the monkey mind. Like, there's ways in which we can combat it as Christians, as Catholics, that we have our own ways, but there's also ways that we could culturally appropriate from others, like acupuncture. So so in short, meditation and yoga, can they ever be baptized, as we like to say? Well, it really depends. And it really depends on the work of holy men and holy women navigating the complexities for us. And I hope today you can see that there are some areas that are, as you've probably well known if you've searched this subject out at all online, as Catholics, that are incompatible. But maybe now you see too that there are places where an incorporation could be possible and even beneficial to us. Blanket black and white treatments on this topic have been abysmal either way. And personally, I think we as Catholics need to do better. As I stated, I mean, come on, guys, we are the heirs of the great scholastic tradition. That was a tradition that was not afraid to engage and borrow from any source, right? And had someone like a Thomas been alive today, I can guarantee you that you traditionalists out there would be that he would be engaging in sources that would scandalize you. I recently saw a Dominican on a platform that I like, and a Dominican that, for what I could tell, I respect. But he was discussing this topic, and I thought his arguments were wholly inadequate and pretty inconsistent. He basically said that, I mean, I'm really not trying to straw man his argument, but really it came down to that certain stretches were demonic. I mean, I kid you not, right? He showed an image of a lady laying on the ground on her back with her hands by her side, superimposed with this image of a yogi doing the same, and said that that posture was demonic and opened us up to evil. And I had to kind of shrug because I sleep in that posture most every night on my back, right? And am I like, does the certain ways that we move our bodies, do demons have a monopoly on that is the question, right? And I kind of cringed when that was his explanation at the very end of why yoga was bad, because the demons have certain monopolies on ways that we move our bodies. It has to be about the intent, right? Because otherwise, when we sleep or when we, like, stretch our backs or something, and it happens to be in a position that corresponds to the way that yoga would position, if it were intrinsically demonic, that means that we would all be, opening ourselves up to spiritual evils. Whereas I think the spiritual evils are more often than not about intention. Ultimately, and look, I'm not going to impose, especially on this priest or anybody else that's condemning these things, but when you condemn these things wholesale, I'm not trying to imply the stereotype of racism on this, but I'm positive these people mean well, and they're concerned about the flock, right? But the message really is that it boils down to that anything Indian, anything foreign, anything not European is not of God and to avoid. And I was watching this because there's a certain irony to a Dominican in particular, an heir to Aquinas, who took on Aristotle, a Greek pagan, with teachings and attributes that would be reprehensible to Christians. But Aquinas extracted the good, right? Aquinas took on Averroes, who his positions on certain parts of what we could say about God and faith and reason wholly incompatible with the Christian faith. Still, we extracted the good, and it's almost like there's like this pagan is good for me, but these pagans are not good for thee. So it's like the attempt to dismiss these people, these cultures out of hand, and without any giving any emphasis to try to baptize the better of these things. Applying what this priest applied to yoga to Indians, you'd never, ever, ever have seen Aristotle be incorporated into the Western philosophical approaches. And there's a real irony to that. So, but I mean, okay. So again, like this is like he's a Dominican, and admittedly, the Dominicans are kind of known for putting the brakes on things. And look, I'm not denouncing that, right? I think that's needed in the faith. I think we need people to stand back and try to say, whoa, you guys are taking things a little bit too far. Let's move back. But some of these people, man, they would love to denounce, they would love to have condemned. And I've heard these, not, I mean, not necessarily priests, but I've heard adherents of certain schools within the Catholic Church that they would love to condemn the Palamites, for example, among our Eastern brethren with their breathing and their emphasis on posture and prayer. And thank God the Church in its infinite wisdom has not allowed that. We, those of us that love the Franciscan school, and I know more than a few who would love to condemn Franciscan theology, we Franciscans have always been much more comfy with Eastern traditions, and specifically Eastern Christian traditions. And honestly, they've been more comfortable with us than they have been with the Dominicans. And certain knee-jerk reactions to everything that doesn't conform to your specific reading of Thomas, being, wanting everything that's not lining up perfectly with your reading of Thomas, wanting to have it condemned. It's just not going to cut it. It's lazy, and it's a disgrace to the witness of Thomas himself. And honestly, the church comes down eventually that those of us that are trying to engage these other cultures are usually on the right, so long as we don't take it too far, because there's admittedly too far. Syncretism is a touchy subject, and honestly, some of these guys do go into the degree of syncretism. But despite the attempts to condemn Aristotle, parts of Aristotle were incorporated in, and we still discuss it. Despite the attempts to completely condemn Confucius, Pope Pius XII came in and said that the Jesuits were right on the Chinese rights controversy. And I think you're going to find eventually in time that there's going to be certain parts of maybe the Vedic schools of the Vedanta tradition that are compatible with certain ways that we can talk about the triune God. And maybe that there's at least medically some aspects of yoga that could be helpful. So, anyways, guys, I feel like this one's going on quite a long time. 55 minutes. I just woke up to Sierra Namasakars, and lo and behold, you're talking about yoga. Let's see. I suppose the reason there is so much wariness regarding yoga is that yoga as a spirituality is oriented towards a Hinduistic perspective of salvation rather than well-being. Catholic in Germany, and I think you make a good point there. But again, with Hindu perspectives, you're talking about multiple variances, and even so much as a ends in particular, right? We can still engage, because if you think about the, just going back to Aristotle for a minute, right? If you really apply the God of Aristotle, and I know the concept of pure act gets butchered by certain polemists out there who want to mock us Catholics for our engaging of Aristotle, but there's a certain degree to where they have a point, because the end result of the God that Aristotle gives us is a God wholly incompatible with the God that walked with Adam in the garden. All right. With the God that sat down and instituted the Eucharist. I mean, but yet still, we can say that there's certain degrees that we can extrapolate from it. And that's kind of what I'm getting at here. And I'm by no means an expert enough in yoga to say, All right, where do we apply that logic to the ends of which yoga spirituality is trying to reach? Read First and Second Maccabees about Greek gymnasia being set up in Jerusalem. Once upon a time, working out, wrestling, boxing, and the Olympics were entirely wound up in Greek. Absolutely, I was going to bring that point up. I forgot about that point. Yeah, no, that's a can of worms there. Thank you for bringing that one up. So what he's talking about is certain wrestling practices, and this is true to kung fu as well. Certain, I know for a fact, I was just mentioning the forms in kung fu. There's certain stretches in kung fu forms, Wing Chun in particular. I know just from doing the stretches that, man, there's got to be some long lost spiritual element to what these forms are doing. And honestly, I do them just as a really comfortable, good stretch. And when you are so far removed from those spiritual elements, it's like, okay, am I, there's so many, look, there's so many things that to be consistent, there are so many things that we as Catholics would have to condemn that we have secularized and practice without even necessarily realizing it. And what he's getting at there with the working out and wrestling and boxing, to be consistent, you would have to condemn basically all forms of recreation, of you would pretty much have to be Puritans, right? We would have to be sitting around and, gosh, who was it, Chesterton, who was the one that said that the Puritans, the mindset of a Puritan is that somewhere, to be angry at the fact that somewhere someone is having a good time, right? And that's what we would have to be consistent across the board with all of these things. It's not directly related to yoga, but a holdover from my Buddhist days that is very useful in a Christian context is loving kindness meditation, where one extends goodwill to all. Yeah, I'll be honest with you. They're Catholic in Germany. Buddhism is one that I have not touched enough to be able to speak about it one way or the other, though I would be certain that there are probably practices within Buddhism. Look, the light of Christ shines across the world, very dim in some areas, brighter in other areas. But there's probably things within the Buddhist tradition that the light of Christ has shined on these, as St. Paul says, it was kind of written in their hearts. So, anyways, guys, look, I'm at an hour. This is kind of a long one. I hope you find this stuff useful. Again, I don't plan on necessarily making friends with these videos, but hopefully you will walk away at least a little bit more cautious in the blanket condemnations that certain practices receive, to maybe give it a little bit more justice, right? Justice to render the due that something deserves. So to give justice to our Indian brothers and sisters of the world who fall under this massively complex thing that we try to call Hinduism, to give them justice that we as Christians should give the charity to all peoples of the world, we should do a better job than just blanket wholesale condemnation. So that's what I got for you guys. I hope you enjoyed this one. God bless you all, and I will see you next time.